Imagine a struggling small town with shuttered factories and fading hope. Then one day, Donald Trump's private plane lands out of nowhere. What follows is a story of unexpected connections, heartfelt promises, and a community's fight to rise again. You won't believe how it ends. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden hues over the quiet streets of Rosewood, a small, predominantly African-American town nestled in the rolling countryside. Life moved at its own rhythm here, a place where neighbors knew each other's names, and the sweet aroma of homemade pies often wafted from open windows. On the town's main street, a cluster of locally owned businesses stood proudly. A family-run diner, a barber shop with its striped poles spinning lazily, and a small grocery store with a chalkboard announcing daily specials. Rosewood wasn't a place accustomed to national attention. It was a community built on resilience, pride, and mutual support, but also marked by the trials of systemic neglect. The train station that once brought bustling commerce now stood quiet, its red bricks weathered by time. Yet there was a vibrancy to the town, a collective warmth that could be felt in the smiles exchanged on the sidewalks and the lively conversations at the Sunday farmers' market. That day, however, the usual rhythm of life was disrupted. A buzz of curiosity and speculation rippled through the town as news spread that a private plane had made an emergency landing at the local airstrip, a rare occurrence in a town that saw more tractors than jets. Even more startling was the rumor about who was aboard: Donald Trump, the former president of the United States. At the diner, locals huddled over their coffee cups debating the news. "What would bring him here?" asked Mr. Jenkins, the elderly barber who often reminisced about the civil rights marches of his youth. At a nearby table, high schooler Maya pulled up a grainy photo on her phone, showing a plane with the distinctive Trump logo. Her friends leaned in, their faces alight with curiosity. At the airstrip, the scene was surreal. The Trump-branded jet, polished and gleaming, looked like a foreign entity against the backdrop of the modest hangars. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, some with folded arms and skeptical gazes, others with smartphones raised, capturing the unexpected spectacle. Inside the plane, Trump sat with his aides, visibly perturbed. An unexpected mechanical issue had forced the landing, leaving him stranded in a town he had likely never heard of. "Where exactly are we?" he asked, his tone impatient. His chief of staff fumbled with a map explaining their situation. The aides exchanged uneasy glances. Rosewood wasn't the kind of place they had planned to visit, but there was no choice but to wait for repairs. Meanwhile, Rosewood's residents debated their response. This was a town that had faced its share of challenges, and many harbored mixed feelings about the man whose policies and rhetoric had often been polarizing. Yet the community's deep-rooted values of hospitality and humanity began to take precedence. As word spread of Trump's arrival, local leaders like Pastor Grace gathered at the town hall to discuss how to approach this unexpected visit. "This is a chance to show what Rosewood is made of," she said firmly, her words carrying the weight of her wisdom. The people nodded, united by a shared resolve to meet this moment with dignity and grace. The stage was set for a day that would bring the town of Rosewood into the national spotlight, not for its trials or its struggles, but for the strength, kindness, and unity of its people. The warm afternoon in the small, predominantly African-American town of Mayfield had locals going about their usual routines. Children played basketball on the cracked courts near the community center, while older residents gathered on porches, sipping sweet tea and sharing stories. The hum of life was punctuated by the distant melody of gospel music coming from the church. It was a day like any other, until the distant roar of jet engines pierced the air. At first, people dismissed it as a cargo plane flying overhead, but the sound grew louder and closer. Heads turned skyward as a sleek private aircraft descended, its golden trim catching the sunlight. The plane was unmistakably luxurious, and it was heading for Mayfield's small, barely used airstrip. Confusion spread among the residents. The airstrip hadn't seen action in years, except for the occasional crop duster or emergency landing. Speculation rippled through the crowd gathering near the fence by the runway. "Who's rich enough to land a plane like that here?" muttered Marvin, the town's unofficial historian. "Maybe it's one of those tech billionaires looking to buy up land," whispered Clara, the town's postmaster, clutching her hat as the jet's engines roared. The plane touched down smoothly, its presence a stark contrast to the worn-down tarmac. As the aircraft came to a halt, its polished exterior gleaming, more townsfolk arrived, curious and buzzing with theories. The town was abuzz with energy it hadn't felt in years. Moments later, the jet's door opened and a set of stairs descended. Out stepped a familiar figure, clad in a sharp suit and sporting his iconic hairstyle, Donald Trump. Gasps rippled through the growing crowd, followed by a cacophony of murmurs. "Is that him?" someone whispered in disbelief. "I thought this was a dream," chuckled Edith, the town's eldest resident. Trump, flanked by a few members of his security team, surveyed the modest airstrip and the gathering crowd with a calm yet curious expression. His presence was unexpected, to say the least. Rumors flew among the townspeople. Was he lost? Was this some sort of campaign stunt? Or was it a simple coincidence? As Trump descended the stairs, his larger-than-life persona seemed almost surreal against the humble backdrop of Mayfield. But what caught the crowd off guard wasn't his arrival. It was his demeanor. He approached the gathering townsfolk with a smile and a wave, not the grandiose gestures many had expected. There was a visible effort to connect, a disarming humility that seemed at odds with the image most had in their minds. "Good afternoon, folks," Trump said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "I know this is unexpected, but sometimes the best things in life are—" The crowd, initially apprehensive, began to loosen up. Questions erupted from all sides. "Why are you here? Is this a campaign thing? What's wrong with your jet?" Trump chuckled, raising his hands to calm the crowd. "Relax, everyone. We had a little engine trouble and needed a safe place to land. Your town seemed like the perfect spot. And let me tell you, it's already looking like a great place to be." The honesty of his explanation, combined with his unexpected warmth, started to shift the mood. Skepticism turned into cautious curiosity. Some residents stepped forward to introduce themselves, and Trump shook hands, asking questions about the town and its people. As the crowd grew, so did the range of emotions. Many saw the moment as an opportunity, a chance to showcase the resilience and spirit of Mayfield, a town often overlooked and underappreciated. Local leaders like Pastor James and school principal Denise approached Trump with a mixture of formality and hope. This encounter could be more than just an emergency stop. It could become a moment that put Mayfield on the map. While some townsfolk remained skeptical, wary of ulterior motives, others embraced the unexpected guest with Southern hospitality. Plates of food and glasses of iced tea began to appear, offered up by those eager to turn this surprise visit into a celebration. The air buzzed with energy as conversations unfolded. Trump, known for his polarizing style, seemed genuinely interested in the stories of the people he met. His questions about the local economy, education, and community projects hinted at something more than mere politeness. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the scene in hues of orange and gold, the initial tension melted away. For now, the focus wasn't on politics or differences, but on the shared humanity of an unexpected meeting. The airstrip grew quieter as the reality of Trump's arrival settled in. While some residents buzzed with excitement, others exchanged uneasy glances. For many in Mayfield, Trump's sudden presence stirred mixed emotions, and misunderstandings were inevitable. As Trump's security team surveyed the area, several residents felt uneasy. "Why's he here?" muttered Earl, the owner of a small auto repair shop. His skeptical tone reflected the thoughts of many. Is this just some PR stunt? We don't need more cameras in our business. Meanwhile, a group of teens gathered near the town square, scrolling through their phones. Do you think he even knows what Mayfield stands for? Asked Jordan, a high school senior who often participated in town hall meetings about social justice. At the same time, Denise, the school principal, tried to keep the peace. Let's give him a chance, she said. It's not every day someone like him lands in our little town. Maybe we can use this to talk about what matters to us. However, the real misunderstanding began at Clara's Diner, a beloved local spot where Trump decided to meet some residents. As he entered the small establishment, flanked by a few aides, the room went silent. Clara herself, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, paused mid-pour with a coffee pot in her hand. "Afternoon," Trump said, offering a smile that some found genuine and others thought calculated. "Afternoon," Clara replied curtly, her tone guarded. She glanced at Denise, who had accompanied him to the diner, hoping to smooth the situation. Trump sat at a booth near the window, nodding politely at the locals. "Nice place you've got here," he commented, picking up a laminated menu. But the tension escalated when Earl, who had followed him inside, leaned against the counter and spoke loudly. "Bet he doesn't even know what grits are," he said with a chuckle. Trump raised an eyebrow, clearly hearing the remark, but choosing not to respond directly. "What do you recommend here?" he asked Clara instead. "Depends on what you're looking for," Clara said. Her words were polite, but her eyes held the sharpness of someone testing his sincerity. The awkwardness only grew when a group of residents, led by Jordan, approached the booth with pointed questions. "What brings you to Mayfield, Mr. Trump?" asked Jordan, crossing his arms. "We're not exactly the kind of town you visit often." Trump, to his credit, met Jordan's gaze. "I wanted to see places like Mayfield firsthand," he replied. "Small towns are the backbone of America, and I've always believed in supporting the people who make this country great." Jordan wasn't convinced. "Words are easy. What about actions?" Denise stepped in, sensing the conversation teetering on the edge of confrontation. "Maybe this is a chance for all of us to talk," she said, placing a hand on Jordan's shoulder. "We can show him what Mayfield is really about." Outside, Pastor James gathered a group of churchgoers who had been observing from a distance. "Let's keep an open mind," he urged them. "This might be an opportunity to share our story, not just listen to his." The atmosphere in the diner shifted slightly as Clara finally served Trump a plate of the day's special, fried chicken with a side of collard greens and cornbread. "This is real food," Clara said, her tone softening. Trump took a bite and nodded appreciatively. "Best I've had in a long time," he said, earning a faint smile from Clara. By the time he left the diner, the misunderstandings hadn't completely dissolved, but a door had been cracked open. Some saw him as a symbol of division, while others saw a man who might, for once, be willing to listen. The crowd outside had grown larger, with whispers spreading about what happened inside. As Trump walked back to his car, he paused to shake hands with Pastor James again. "Thank you for welcoming me," he said. Pastor James replied, "Our town's strength comes from listening, even when it's hard. I hope you'll do the same." For the first time, Trump looked genuinely moved. "I'll try," he said quietly, his tone less rehearsed than before. Though the day wasn't free of tension, Mayfield was beginning to show its true colors. A town rooted in resilience, respect, and the belief that even the most unlikely visitors could learn something valuable. The dinner was held in the modest yet warm town hall of Meadow Springs, a stark contrast to the opulent banquet rooms Trump was accustomed to. Wooden beams lined the ceiling, and tables were draped with checkered cloths, adorned with candles in mason jars. The room buzzed with quiet curiosity as locals trickled in, unsure what to expect. Many of them were African American, a demographic Trump had rarely engaged with so intimately during his presidency. Trump entered the hall, his towering presence commanding attention, but his demeanor seemed softer, almost curious. Sarah, the town's mayor, warmly welcomed him, guiding him to the main table where elders of the community, including Reverend Thomas and Miss Loretta, a retired schoolteacher, were seated. "Thank you for hosting me," Trump said, his voice carrying both formality and genuine appreciation. "It's not often I get to see such a vibrant community up close." The Reverend nodded, his voice steady but cautious. "We're honored to have you, Mr. President. But I hope you'll leave here understanding more about us than you came with." Dinner began with a prayer led by Miss Loretta, her words weaving a story of unity and resilience. As plates of fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, and sweet potato pie were passed around, the mood shifted. The aroma of home-cooked meals filled the room, breaking barriers faster than words ever could. Initially, the conversation at Trump's table was stilted. The locals, hesitant and wary, avoided direct eye contact. Trump, on the other hand, seemed slightly out of his depth, unused to the unpolished honesty that small-town folks offered. Sarah broke the tension by sharing stories about the town's history, from its origins as a safe haven during the civil rights movement to its current struggles with education and health care. "What's it like running a town like this?" Trump asked, leaning forward. Sarah hesitated, then replied, "It's fulfilling, but challenging. We're resourceful, but we're often overlooked, by leaders, by policies. It's as if we're invisible." Trump frowned slightly, his hand resting on his glass of sweet tea. "Invisible? That's not what America is about. Everyone should be seen." Miss Loretta, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "That's a nice sentiment, Mr. President. But it doesn't always feel that way. Many of us here have spent decades fighting to be seen, to be heard." Her words hung in the air, and Trump seemed to absorb them more deeply than expected. "Maybe that's something I need to hear more often," he admitted. As the meal progressed, stories flowed more freely. Reverend Thomas shared the community's efforts to rebuild after a devastating flood, while Miss Loretta described teaching generations of children, instilling in them pride and resilience. Trump, in turn, shared anecdotes about the challenges of decision-making as president, peppering them with humor that drew laughter from the table. At one point, young Jamal, a high school student and aspiring architect, approached Trump hesitantly. "Mr. President, can I ask you something?" he said, his voice steady but nervous. "Of course," Trump replied, motioning for him to speak. "What would you say to a kid like me who wants to make it big but feels like the world doesn't see him?" Trump paused, his usual bravado replaced with uncharacteristic introspection. "I'd say the world isn't always fair, Jamal, but you don't let that stop you. You work harder, smarter, and prove everyone wrong. And when you get to the top, you don't forget where you came from." Jamal nodded, his expression a mix of hope and determination. The room seemed to collectively exhale, the tension replaced with an air of cautious optimism. By the time dessert was served, conversations were flowing with a newfound ease. Trump, uncharacteristically, listened more than he spoke, nodding thoughtfully as locals shared their joys and grievances. As the evening wound down, Sarah stood to address the room. "Tonight, we've done something special," she said. "We've sat together, broken bread, and shared stories. That's the foundation of understanding. Seeing each other as people, not as labels or headlines." Trump nodded in agreement, standing to join her. "This dinner has been more than I expected. You've shown me a side of America that's rich in character and heart. I may not have all the answers, but tonight I've learned, and for that, I'm grateful." As the night ended, Trump shook hands with many attendees, lingering in conversations longer than anyone anticipated. He left the hall with a bag of leftovers, a humble yet poignant reminder of the community that had opened its doors and hearts to him. The townspeople, too, felt a shift. While skepticism remained, many admitted that Trump's willingness to sit, listen, and share a meal felt like a small but meaningful step toward understanding. Trump stepped out of the community center into the cool evening air, the gentle hum of cicadas and rustling leaves, providing a tranquil backdrop. Pinewood, with its weathered picket fences and tree-lined streets, seemed frozen in time. The sidewalks were lined with small African-American-owned businesses, a barber shop, a soul food diner, a corner store with a hand-painted sign. Each told a story of resilience and pride, much like the people who called Pinewood home. Wearing his signature suit and red tie, Trump adjusted his cufflinks as he walked, accompanied by a modest security detail. The town's residents, still skeptical after the dinner, lingered on porches or peeked out from behind curtains. It wasn't every day they saw a former president walking through their streets. The walk wasn't planned. Trump had insisted on seeing the town on foot. "I want to understand this place," he had told his aides earlier, brushing off concerns about protocol or security. As he strolled past the diner, the aroma of fried chicken and collard greens wafted into the air. A group of elderly men, seated on a bench outside, watched him intently. One of them, Mr. Ernest, a retired school principal, leaned forward. "You don't look like you belong here, Mr. President," he called out, his voice carrying a mix of challenge and curiosity. Trump stopped, smiled, and approached. "Maybe I don't," he replied, extending a hand. "But I'm here, and I'd like to hear from you." The men exchanged glances, taken aback by the openness of his response. They scooted over, making room for him on the bench. Trump sat down, his towering frame slightly hunched to listen better. Mr. Ernest spoke of Pinewood's history, how it had been a safe haven for African Americans fleeing the big cities during times of racial tension, how the community had thrived despite systemic challenges. Another man, Harold, talked about his struggles to keep his small grocery store afloat during the pandemic. Trump listened, nodding occasionally, interjecting only to ask questions. "I didn't know about Pinewood," Trump admitted, "but hearing this makes me wonder why towns like this don't get the attention they deserve." The men chuckled. "We've been wondering the same thing for decades, sir," Ernest said, his tone a blend of sarcasm and truth. Further along the walk, Trump stopped outside a small community library. A group of children were gathered, their laughter spilling into the night. A woman named Linda, their teacher, emerged holding a book. She hesitated before addressing him. "These kids," she said, gesturing to the group, "are brilliant, but their schools don't have enough resources. We have to fight for everything." Trump nodded. "Education is the foundation," he said. "No child should feel like they're starting at a disadvantage." Linda folded her arms. "Words are one thing, Mr. Trump. Action is another." Her directness caught him off guard, but he respected it. "You're right," he admitted, "and maybe my being here is a step toward doing better." As Trump continued his walk, the mood began to shift. People stepped out of their homes, some joining him, others simply observing. He made a point to greet everyone, offering handshakes, taking photos, and listening to concerns. In those brief interactions, the town began to see a different side of the man they had preconceived notions about. He wasn't just a figurehead from television or politics. He was a man walking through their streets, engaging with their lives. By the time he returned to the community center, a small crowd had gathered. The conversations, while brief, had planted a seed. Pinewood, long accustomed to being overlooked, had been seen that night, not through speeches or policies, but through the simple act of walking and listening. The next morning, the town square of Pinewood buzzed with an energy it hadn't seen in years. Word had spread that Trump planned to make an announcement, and residents gathered, curious and skeptical, to see what the former president had to say. Children ran around the gazebo where a microphone and a modest podium had been hastily set up. Elders sat on folding chairs, their expressions cautious, but intrigued. The scene was one of cautious optimism, a reflection of a community unsure of what to expect, but willing to listen. Trump approached the podium with measured steps. The usual bravado was softened, replaced by an air of earnestness. Behind him stood Elijah, the veteran whose story had touched him deeply, Grace, the school teacher, and a few community leaders. The sight of familiar faces standing alongside Trump gave the moment a sense of gravity. "I've been to a lot of towns," Trump began, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "Big towns, small towns, places you see on TV and places you don't. But Pinewood? Pinewood is different. This town doesn't just have history, it has heart." The crowd exchanged glances, some nodding, others crossing their arms. Trump continued, recounting the stories he had heard over dinner, the factory workers who had built their livelihoods brick by brick, the teachers striving to provide for their students, and the families who had kept the town's spirit alive despite adversity. "And that's why I'm here today," Trump said, his voice firm. "To tell you that Pinewood's story isn't over. I'm pledging to donate $10 million to help reopen the factory and invest in modernizing your school. This town, this community, is a testament to the American dream, and it deserves every chance to thrive again." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The announcement was unexpected, almost too good to be true. Grace, standing behind Trump, remained composed but couldn't hide the glimmer of hope in her eyes. Elijah placed a hand over his heart, overwhelmed by the gesture. For many in the crowd, it was the first time in years they had heard someone from outside Pinewood speak with such conviction about their future. But not everyone was convinced. Tasha, standing near the back of the crowd, folded her arms. "Words are nice, but we've heard them before," she muttered to a friend. Still, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of appreciation that someone of Trump's stature was even addressing their town's struggles. Elijah stepped forward, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Mr. Trump," he said, his weathered face turned toward the former president, "you've given us something many of us had lost. Hope. For that, I thank you." Trump turned to shake Elijah's hand, the sincerity in his expression disarming even some of his harshest critics in the crowd. "Thank you, Elijah," he said. "Your service, your resilience, it's what makes this country great." The applause started slow but grew, spreading through the square like a wave. Even Tasha found herself clapping, though still cautious in her optimism. For a moment, Pinewood stood united, not in blind belief, but in the possibility of change. Trump lingered after the announcement, mingling with the crowd. He shook hands, listened to concerns, and even posed for photos with families. It was a side of him that many hadn't seen, a man genuinely trying to connect. As the sun began to set, Grace approached Trump, her posture reserved. "Mr. Trump," she said, "if you're serious about this, we'll hold you to it. Pinewood doesn't need promises. We need action." Trump met her gaze. "And you'll get it," he said firmly. "Pinewood isn't just any town. It's a place worth fighting for." The evening ended with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long time, Pinewood didn't feel forgotten. Whether Trump's pledge would lead to lasting change remained uncertain. But in that moment, the people of Pinewood allowed themselves to believe that it might. The sun rose on Pinewood's annual Unity Festival, a cherished tradition that had persisted despite the town's challenges. This year, the festival carried a weightier significance, with a community eager to embrace a sense of renewal and purpose. The aroma of barbecued ribs and fresh cornbread wafted through the air as vendors set up their stalls. Children played games, and a small stage in the town square awaited the day's speakers and performers. Trump arrived without fanfare, his demeanor noticeably different from the commanding presence typically associated with his appearances. He wore a casual blazer and jeans, blending into the crowd rather than separating himself with VIP treatment. When he chose a seat among the residents instead of a reserved area, the gesture didn't go unnoticed. Grace, who had been organizing the event for years, exchanged a surprised glance with Tasha. The festival began with local musicians performing folk and blues tunes that reflected the town's cultural roots. Residents clapped along, sharing laughter and stories. For a day, the worries of factory closures and school funding faded into the background, replaced by a collective celebration of resilience and hope. When it came time for the speeches, Grace took the stage first. She adjusted the microphone and scanned the crowd, her voice steady but full of emotion. "This festival has always been about more than music and food," she said. "It's about coming together as a community, reminding ourselves that no matter how tough things get, we're stronger when we stand united." She glanced toward Trump, a subtle acknowledgement of the events of the past few days. "We've been reminded recently," she continued, "that listening to each other, really listening, can lead to unexpected understanding. That's the foundation of unity." The applause was heartfelt, but it was Tasha's speech that carried a sharper edge. She stepped forward, her natural charisma commanding attention. "Unity doesn't mean we all agree," she began. "It means we respect each other enough to hear different perspectives, even when it's hard. This town has seen its share of disagreements, but look around. We're here together, stronger because of it." Her words resonated, bridging gaps that had seemed insurmountable only days before. Even those who had been skeptical of Trump's presence found themselves nodding, caught up in the spirit of the day. Finally, Trump was invited to speak. He rose from his seat among the residents, stopping to shake a few hands as he approached the stage. His speech was brief but pointed, crafted to echo the themes of the festival. "Pinewood is a town that doesn't quit," he began, his voice firm but approachable. "I've seen that in every person I've spoken to here. You remind us that resilience isn't just a word, it's a way of life. It's what makes this country great." He paused, scanning the crowd. "Unity doesn't mean forgetting our differences. It means recognizing that at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, a chance to succeed, to see our families thrive, to leave something better for the next generation. That's the American spirit, and it's alive and well in Pinewood." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time in years, the town felt whole. Trump stepped down from the stage, returning to his seat rather than retreating to a private area. It was a small act, but one that spoke volumes. As the festival continued into the evening with fireworks lighting up the night sky, Pinewood found itself transformed, not by promises alone, but by the sense that unity and resilience could indeed pave the way for change. The day of departure arrived with a bright, clear morning, the kind that seemed tailor-made for new beginnings. Pinewood's small airstrip buzzed with quiet activity as Trump's plane stood ready for takeoff. The residents who had gathered to see him off were subdued yet hopeful, reflecting on the whirlwind days that had brought both challenges and revelations. Trump, flanked by his aides, approached the group waiting to bid him farewell. Tasha, Grace, and Marcus stood at the forefront, their expressions a mix of gratitude and guarded optimism. Trump extended his hand to Grace first. "You've got a good town here," he said. "It's been an honor to see its strength firsthand." Grace shook his hand firmly. "And we'll hold you to your word, Mr. Trump," she replied, her tone steady but warm. "This community deserves the support you've pledged." Turning to Tasha, Trump offered a slight nod of respect. "I hope you keep pushing for what's right," he said. "Pinewood needs leaders like you." Tasha met his gaze without hesitation. "We'll keep pushing, Mr. Trump, and we'll make sure you deliver on what you've promised. This town doesn't forget its struggles." Lastly, Trump approached Marcus. "You represent the best of this place," he said, shaking the veteran's hand with sincerity. "Your story reminded me of what resilience looks like." Marcus smiled faintly. "This town has a lot of stories like mine, Mr. Trump. I hope you remember them." Before boarding the plane, Trump handed Grace a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "To the people of Pinewood, thank you for your hospitality and for reminding me of the power of community. This town's spirit is something special. Don't ever let it fade. With gratitude, Donald J. Trump." As the plane's engines roared to life, the crowd stepped back, watching the scene with mixed emotions. Grace held the note tightly, its words a small but meaningful acknowledgement of the town's impact on a figure often seen as distant from their struggles. Standing beside her, Tasha crossed her arms, her expression resolute. "He's made promises," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "Now it's up to us to make sure he keeps them." Grace turned to her with a thoughtful smile. "It's also up to us to keep pushing forward no matter what. Pinewood isn't just waiting for change, it's creating it." As the plane lifted into the sky, the residents of Pinewood watched it ascend, the sight both a farewell and a reminder of the work that lay ahead. The past few days had left their mark, not just in the commitments made, but in the renewed sense of purpose and unity among the townspeople. As the plane disappeared into the horizon, Pinewood stood stronger, determined to seize its future, no matter how high the odds or how long the journey.